Have you ever underestimated someone, only to realize you were out of your depth? You won't believe what happened when a young reporter tried to take down Clint Eastwood. But the real twist, it's still coming. You won't want to miss how this story unfolds. Dear listeners, before we move forward, please subscribe my channel to achieve Goal 1,000 numbers. The ballroom at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel was a spectacle of elegance. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in warm light, their reflections bouncing off gold-trimmed walls. The air was thick with the scent of aged whiskey, expensive perfume, and the subtle tension that always lingered when Hollywood's elite gathered under one roof. Guests in tailored suits and designer gowns floated from table to table, their voices a controlled murmur of industry gossip, forced laughter, and backhanded compliments. Some were here for the cause. Tonight's gala was in support of veterans' mental health initiatives. But for many, it was just another photo op, a chance to be seen, to network, to reinforce their place in the industry's pecking order. And then Clint Eastwood walked in. No entourage, no grand entrance, just him in a well-fitted black suit, hands tucked casually into his pockets, exuding the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need an introduction. At 94 years old, he moved slower than he used to, but there was still something in his posture, something in the way his eyes scanned the room that commanded respect. Conversation shifted mid-sentence. Eyes darted in his direction. A few guests whispered to their companions. He wasn't the kind of celebrity you fawned over. You acknowledged him. You respected him. He approached a small group near the bar, greeted a couple of longtime friends with a firm handshake, and leaned in slightly to hear their conversation over the soft jazz playing in the background. He wasn't one for small talk, but he had a way of making people feel like what they were saying mattered, a rare trait in this room. Across the ballroom, a young journalist named Brandon Keller was watching. He wasn't a household name, but in the world of political commentary, he was making a name for himself as the fearless, no-nonsense voice of a new generation. His articles, mostly attacks on outdated conservative figures, had gotten him a decent following on social media. Tonight, he saw an opportunity. Clint Eastwood was a relic, a man from an era that no longer fit the Hollywood narrative. Keller was going to make a statement, but something in his expression, a mix of arrogance and excitement, hinted at the fact that he had already decided how this confrontation would go. He wasn't here for a discussion. He was here for a takedown, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. Brandon Keller straightened his tie, grabbed his phone, already set to record, and made his way through the crowd. He wasn't nervous. He was confident. Too confident. This wasn't just about calling out an old actor's outdated views. It was about making a scene, a viral moment. As he approached, the energy at the bar shifted slightly. A few guests took a step back, sensing an interruption. Clint Eastwood, in the middle of listening to a war veteran's story, barely acknowledged the young man's presence. That only fueled Keller's determination. He cleared his throat, flashing a tight-lipped smile. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice loud enough to draw attention. "Brandon Keller, the Sentinel Review. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Eastwood gave him a glance, brief, unreadable, and then turned back to his conversation. Keller didn't like that. He took a small step closer. "I'll make it quick," he added, forcing a chuckle. "I just wanted to get your thoughts on, well, Hollywood's changing landscape. You've been in the industry for over 60 years. Do you think people like you still have a place in it?" The subtle jab was intentional. The words, "people like you," hung in the air, heavy with implication. A few guests nearby turned their attention to the exchange. Someone set their drink down a little too loudly. Even the bartender mid-pour paused for half a second. Clint Eastwood finally looked at him. His gaze was steady, like a man deciding whether or not something was worth his time. Keller pressed on. "Because, you know," he continued, "Hollywood is evolving. The old ways of thinking, the outdated masculinity," he made a vague hand gesture, "conservative values. A lot of people believe it's time to move forward, that guys like you are out of touch with what modern audiences want." There it was, the line Keller had been waiting to say. The setup was perfect. He was on camera, in front of an audience, standing toe-to-toe with a Hollywood legend. This was his moment. He could already picture the headline. Clint Eastwood finally called out. Watch him stumble over his own ignorance. But that headline was about to fall apart, because Clint Eastwood wasn't the one stumbling. For a second, Clint Eastwood just looked at him. Not with anger, not with offense, just the kind of stare that made a man question if he'd made the right decision. A slow, steady silence stretched between them, pulling in the attention of everyone within earshot. Then Eastwood sighed, not the kind of sigh that came from exhaustion, but the kind that signaled complete and utter disinterest. He reached for his drink, took a small sip, then set it back down before finally speaking. "You rehearsed that one, didn't you?" A chuckle rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Low, but unmistakable. Keller's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "I'm just asking the questions people want answers to," he shot back. Eastwood tilted his head slightly. "People," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Or just you?" Keller hesitated. That wasn't part of the script in his head. The veteran actor leaned forward slightly, resting an elbow on the bar. "You think the world just moves forward because some guy with a keyboard says so?" Eastwood asked. "That real change happens because somebody like you points a finger and says, 'That's old, throw it out.'" Keller opened his mouth, but Eastwood didn't give him the chance. "Let me tell you something, kid." His voice was steady, measured, the same tone he'd used in 100 films when delivering a line that sent chills through the screen. "You don't erase the past just because you don't like it. You learn from it. You build on it. You take what worked, fix what didn't, and move forward. That's progress, not whatever the hell this is." He gestured vaguely at Keller, mimicking the young man's earlier dismissive hand wave. This time, the chuckle from the crowd was louder. Someone clapped. Keller's face reddened, but he wasn't ready to back down. "With all due respect, Mr. Eastwood," Keller said, his voice a little tighter, "it's easy for you to talk about learning from the past when you were part of a generation that had it easier." A murmur ran through the room, not in Keller's favor. A few guests exchanged glances, unimpressed by the bold but flimsy argument. Eastwood let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Easier?" He repeated the word like it was the dumbest thing he'd heard all night. "I started in Hollywood when they still told actors like me to change their name because it sounded too rough. I worked as a bricklayer before I ever got in front of a camera. You think it was easier?" He let the words hang for a beat. "You ever had to shovel asphalt in the middle of summer just to afford a meal?" Keller blinked. He hadn't been prepared for that. But Eastwood wasn't done. "I've seen guys like you before," he said, taking another sip of his drink, looking for a soundbite, hoping to make a scene. "But here's the thing. You walked in here thinking I was going to fold, that I'd get mad, stumble over my words, maybe even storm off. But I don't do performances on command. That's your job." The audience laughed again. This time, not just a few, but nearly half the room. A couple of guests actually applauded. Keller felt it, the creeping awareness that this wasn't going the way he planned. Brandon Keller's confidence cracked, but he refused to show it. He forced a smirk, adjusting his posture like he still had control. But the problem was he had already lost. He just hadn't figured it out yet. He cleared his throat, reaching for anything to regain momentum. "All right, so maybe you had some struggles," he said, his voice not as sharp as before. "But don't you think there's a reason people your age are being left behind in Hollywood? Maybe audiences don't want outdated ideas shoved down their throats anymore." Eastwood let out a short chuckle, the kind that wasn't amused, just disappointed. "Left behind?" he repeated, shaking his head. "Son, I've outlived entire Hollywood trends. Been written off more times than I can count. Yeah, part of the reason," he continued, "is because people like you try to tear down the past instead of building something real." The words hit Keller like a gut punch. The rest of the room seemed to close in on him. Clint Eastwood didn't need to prove anything. He never did. He let his work speak for itself, and time was the judge of what mattered. Those who tried to erase history would fade into irrelevance on their own. And in the end, it wasn't about who screamed the loudest. It was about who actually had something to say. The world was full of people looking